Somewhere inside your body, right now, there are 3 sets of instructions that should never have met. The first came from people who hunted reindeer across a frozen continent. They had dark skin and pale blue eyes, and for tens of thousands of years, they were the only humans in Europe. The second came from farmers who walked out of what is now Turkey, carrying wheat, barley, sheep and goats. And a way of living that would erase almost everything that came before it. The third came from horsemen on the open grasslands north of the Black Sea. They arrived around 5,000 years ago, and within a few centuries they had changed as much as 90% of the ancestry of the people living in Britain. None of these 3 peoples would have recognised the others. 2 of them vanished so completely that until about 10 years ago we did not fully know they had existed. And then something changed. Geneticists discovered that a small dense piece of bone deep inside the human skull, the petrous bone of the inner ear, preserves DNA far better than any other part of the body. Suddenly, the dead could be read. What they said rewrote the prehistory of an entire continent. Europe was not settled once, it was settled 3 times, and each time the people already living there were overwhelmed. This is the story of how Europe was made, unmade, and made again. To understand what happened, we have to begin at the coldest moment in recent human history. Around 26,000 years ago, the ice reached its greatest extent. Sheets more than 3 kilometres thick covered Scandinavia, the Baltic and most of Britain. South of the ice lay a treeless, wind-scoured plain, the Mammoth Steppe, stretching from the Atlantic coast of France all the way into Siberia. Sea levels were roughly 120 metres lower than today. Britain was not an island. The North Sea was a plain of rivers and marshes. You could have walked from what is now Norfolk to what is now the Netherlands without getting your feet wet. And scattered across this frozen world were the hunter-gatherers. There were never many of them. Some estimates put the entire human population of Europe during the coldest phase at only a few thousand people. They survived by retreating into pockets of milder land, refuges in southern France and northern Spain, in Italy, in the Balkans, and waiting out a climate that would have killed anything less adaptable. They were extraordinary at what they did. They made blades from flint that were sharper than surgical steel. They sewed fitted clothing with bone needles. They painted the caves at Lascaux and Altamira with an accuracy of observation that modern zoologists still find startling. And when the ice finally began to withdraw, around 15,000 years ago, they followed it north. This is where ancient DNA gives us our first shock. For most of the 20th century, the assumption was simple. Europeans had lived in Europe, more or less continuously, for a very long time. Cultures changed, technologies spread, but the people themselves stayed. Prehistory was a story of ideas moving between populations, not populations replacing one another. Then, in 2014, researchers sequenced the genome of a man who died roughly 7,000 years ago in a cave called Le Bras, in the mountains of northern Spain. He was a hunter-gatherer from a lineage that had been in Europe for tens of thousands of years, and when the genes governing pigmentation were read, they returned a combination nobody had predicted. Dark skin. Blue eyes. 4 years later, the same result came out of Britain. A skeleton, known as Cheddar Man, found in a gorge in Somerset and dating to around 10,000 years ago, carried the same signature, dark to intermediate skin pigmentation, paired with light eyes. These were not isolated cases. Sample after sample from Mesolithic Europe returned the same pattern. The pale skin we associate with Northern Europe today was not there. It arrived later, and it arrived with other people. Think about what that means. The hunter-gatherers of Europe were not an early draft of modern Europeans. They were a distinct population, with their own appearance, their own genetic signature, and their own long history on the continent. Geneticists gave them a name, the Western hunter-gatherers. For a few thousand years after the ice retreated, they had Europe entirely to themselves. The forests came back, birch first, then pine, then oak and hazel and elm. The Mammoth Steppe disappeared, and with it the mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the cave lion. The hunter-gatherers adapted, as they always had. They moved to the rivers and the coasts. They fished. They gathered shellfish in such quantities that their discarded shells built mounds visible from the sea. They tamed wolves, or wolves tamed themselves. and the dog entered human history. Their populations were small, mobile and thinly spread. A band of 30 people might range across hundreds of square kilometres. Across the whole of Europe, there may have been only tens of thousands of them. And that number is the reason for everything that happened next. Because roughly 8,500 years ago, boats began arriving in the Aegean, carrying people who lived in a completely different way. They came from Anatolia, the great peninsula that is now Turkey, and behind them lay a transformation that had begun several thousand years earlier in the Fertile Crescent. There, in the hills of what is now Syria, Iraq, Turkey and Iran, human beings had done something no species had ever done before. They had stopped following food and started producing it. Wheat, barley, lentils and peas, sheep, goats, cattle and pigs. We call it the Neolithic Revolution, and it is probably the single most consequential thing our species has ever done. But for most of the last century, archaeologists argued fiercely about how it reached Europe. One camp said the idea spread, farming techniques passed from group to group, and Europe's existing hunter-gatherers gradually adopted them. The population stayed the same, only the lifestyle changed. The other camp said the people spread. Farmers physically migrated into Europe, bringing their crops, their animals and their genes with them. Ancient Dina settled the argument, and it settled it decisively. The farmers who appear in Europe from around 6,500 BC are not descended from Europe's hunter-gatherers. Genetically, they are almost indistinguishable from Neolithic populations in Anatolia. They are migrants, an entire farming population moving west. They took two routes. One followed the Mediterranean coast, moving by sea from island to island and headland to headland, reaching Italy, southern France and eastern Spain with remarkable speed. Archaeologists identify them by their distinctive pottery, decorated by pressing the edge of a cockle shell into wet clay. This is the cardial culture. The other route pushed up through the Balkans and into the great river valleys of Central Europe, the Danube, the Rhine, the Elbe. These farmers left behind long timber houses, sometimes 40 metres from end to end, and pottery decorated with incised bands and spirals. Archaeologists call them the linear pottery culture, and their expansion across the lowest soils of Central Europe was astonishingly fast. In some regions, the farming frontier advanced at around 1 kilometre per year, generation after generation, for centuries. It is worth pausing on what one of those villages actually was, because it is easy to say farmers arrived and lose the human scale of it. Picture a clearing cut from oak forest on the light, fertile lowest soil above a tributary of the Danube. Standing in it are 5 or 6 timber longhouses, each one built from massive split posts driven into the ground, walls of woven branches packed with clay, a roof of thatch steep enough to shed rain. Some of these houses are 40 metres long, longer than a modern swimming pool, and inside they are dim, smoky and divided into sections. Animals at one end, grain stored at the other, up off the ground, away from rats. A family living in between, around a hearth that never quite goes out. Outside, the ground has been cleared by fire and axe. Wheat and barley grow in small plots that are weeded by hand. Cattle graze in the woodland margins. A woman grinds grain on a saddle quern, pushing a stone back and forth for hours to make enough flour for a day. A task that leaves distinctive wear on the bones of the wrist and toes, which archaeologists can still identify 5,000 years later. Nobody in this village will ever travel more than a few days' walk from it. Most will die before 40. And yet the descendants of this village will spread across a continent, because every generation that fills its land sends its surplus children a little further up the river to clear another patch of forest and start again. That is the mechanism. Not an invasion, a slow, relentless budding, repeated for 200 generations. They did not conquer Europe. There is very little evidence of organised warfare in this period. What they did was far more decisive than conquest. They outpopulated it. A farming village can support many times more people per square kilometre than a hunter-gatherer band. Grain can be stored, which means surviving a bad winter. Domestic animals provide meat on demand and milk and wool and traction. Sedentary mothers can wean children earlier and have them closer together, because they do not have to carry an infant across the landscape. The result is compounding. A farming population does not simply live differently from a foraging population. It grows at a rate a foraging population cannot match, and it keeps growing until the land is full. Estimates vary, but the arrival of agriculture may have increased the human population of Europe by a factor of 50 or more over a few thousand years. Against that arithmetic, the hunter-gatherers had no answer. In Britain, the evidence is particularly stark. A study published in 2019 examined the genomes of dozens of individuals from before and after the arrival of farming around 4000 BC. The result was almost total turnover. Neolithic Britons derive the overwhelming majority of their ancestry from incoming farmers, with only a small fraction, in some analyses only a few percent, traceable to the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had lived there for thousands of years. The people who built the first monuments of Britain, the long barrows and the causewayed enclosures, were not the descendants of the people who painted the caves. They were the great-great-grandchildren of migrants from the Aegean. This is the first of the two great replacements. But it is important to be precise about what replacement means here, because the word carries weight it should not carry. There is no evidence of extermination. What the genetics show is a demographic process, not a massacre. In some regions, hunter-gatherer and farming communities lived alongside each other for centuries. In parts of Central Europe, they seem to have largely ignored one another. Different diets, different burial practices, different worlds occupying the same landscape. And crucially, the hunter-gatherer ancestry does not vanish. It declines, and then, remarkably, it comes back. In the later Neolithic, across much of Europe, the proportion of hunter-gatherer ancestry in farming populations rises again. The two groups were intermarrying. Slowly, unevenly, over hundreds of years, the older population was absorbed rather than erased. Everyone alive in Europe today carries some of it. By around 5,500 years ago, Europe was a continent of farmers. Villages covered the fertile river valleys. In the Balkans, settlement mounds rose metre by metre as generations rebuilt on the ruins of their ancestors' houses. On the Atlantic fringe, communities were raising megaliths, the passage tombs of Ireland, the stone rows of Brittany, the first phases of Stonehenge. In the copper-bearing hills of the Balkans and the Alps, metallurgy was beginning. And then, something went wrong. Across large parts of Europe, beginning around 3500 BC, the archaeological record thins out. Settlements are abandoned. Pollen cores show forests regrowing over land that had been cleared for crops. Radiocarbon dates, which gathered in large numbers, can serve as a rough proxy for population size, drop sharply in region after region. Something reduced the Neolithic population of Europe substantially, and for a long time nobody could say what. Climate was one candidate. Soil exhaustion was another. But in 2018, a team examining the teeth of a young woman buried around 4,900 years ago in a Neolithic tomb in Sweden found something unexpected in her bloodstream. Yersinia pestis. Plague. It was not the same organism that would later cause the Black Death. This early strain lacked some of the genetic machinery that allows fleas to transmit the disease efficiently. But it was plague, and it was circulating in Neolithic Europe more than 4,000 years before the epidemics we know from history. Similar findings have since emerged from other late Neolithic sites across Europe and the steppe. The picture is still debated, and plague is unlikely to be the whole explanation, but it fits a pattern that makes sense. Dense, sedentary settlements. Close contact with domestic animals. Poor sanitation. Trade networks linking communities across hundreds of kilometres. The Neolithic gave humanity food security. It also gave humanity epidemic disease. Whatever the cause, by around 3000 BC the farming societies of Europe were weakened and thinned. And at exactly that moment, on the grasslands far to the east, a third population was learning to do something nobody had done before. North of the Black Sea and the Caspian, between the Dnieper and the Volga, lies a belt of open grassland that runs east for thousands of kilometres. This is the Pontic-Caspian steppe. It is dry, flat, and largely treeless, and for most of prehistory it was almost useless to human beings. Too dry for reliable farming, too open for hunting. A place to cross, not a place to live. You are the result of 3 such collisions. So is everyone around you. And the bones are still being excavated. The sequencing is getting cheaper and faster every year. Regions that have barely been sampled much of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, Central Asia, North Africa, are only beginning to be read. Which means the story you have just heard is not finished. It is the version we can see from where we are standing, in the first decades of a science barely 15 years old. There are almost certainly more lost peoples down there. We simply have not found them yet.